She came to me during the Midwinter Rite of Thornvale, in the 3rd year of my reign, on the night I had decided to feel nothing. I remember the decision clearly. I remember the cold drafts moving through the columns of the great hall, the smell of pine resin burning in the iron sconces, the weight of the crown on my head that had not yet learned the shape of my skull. I was 26 years old and already tired in the particular way that power makes a man tired, not from the body, but from the performance of certainty. The hall was full. 300 wolves of the western reaches had come to Thornvale Hold for the season's rite, and every one of them was watching me for signs of softness, of longing, of anything they could use. I had decided, somewhere between the first goblet and the opening procession, that I would give them nothing. Then the musicians changed their measure, and I heard her laugh. I was not looking in her direction. I was speaking to my council's eldest member, old Warden Creswick, about the spring border assessments. Nothing, useful nothing, and I heard a laugh ring out from somewhere near the south hearth, low and unhurried, the kind of laugh a person makes when they are genuinely surprised by something delightful. It was not a performance. That was what stopped me. I had heard hundreds of performances that evening, laughter shaped to carry, smiles angled toward my line of sight. This one landed on no one. It was meant for nothing but itself. I turned without deciding to. She was standing beside the south hearth with an older woman I didn't recognize. A guest, not Pack. Her dress a deep plain green without embroidery. Her dark hair pinned with a single silver comb. She was laughing at something the older woman had said, and as I watched, she pressed her hand briefly over her own mouth as though trying to contain it, and her eyes, dark, steady, lit by the fire, were full of warmth so unguarded, it was almost difficult to look at directly. My wolf did not howl. He did not surge or claw at me, or make himself known in any dramatic way. What happened was quieter than that. And stranger, a door I had not known was open went suddenly, absolutely still, as though the draft had stopped. As though something that had been moving had found its place and ceased. I was across the hall before I understood I was moving. I did not have a plan. I am not a man who acts without plans. I had built my reign on the discipline of never being caught without one. But I walked the length of the room between the columns and the feast tables and the watching wolves, and arrived at the south hearth with nothing in my hands and no more idea of what I was doing than a man waking mid-step from a dream. She saw me coming. I will give her that. She did not pretend otherwise, did not glance away, and then back with that particular affected surprise. She simply turned to face me when I was still a few paces off, and her expression was composed, careful, and entirely too honest. "My lord," she said, and it was a greeting with no performance behind it, which meant she wanted nothing from me. And that was the most disarming thing anyone had said to me in 3 years. "I don't know you," I said, which was not what I had meant to say. I had meant to say something appropriate, something kingly. The corner of her mouth moved. "No," she agreed. "I don't believe you do." Behind me I could feel the shift in the room. 300 wolves who had been watching me like a sky watches weather, but I could not make myself care about it just then. "Are you attached to this particular hearth?" I asked her. She glanced at it. "Not especially." "The musicians have changed their measure," I said. "I think they intend a circle dance." I paused. "I thought perhaps you might," and then I ran out of words, which had not happened to me since I was a boy, and I stood there like an idiot with my mouth stopped and the fire at her back turning her plain green dress to something that looked like forest in summer. She studied me for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, and something passed through them that I couldn't read. Consideration, perhaps, or a decision being made quickly. And then she said, "One dance, my lord." "Yes, I think I should like that. One dance." We danced among the circle with the others, her hand warm and light in mine, her steps precise in a way that told me she had once learned this properly, and then gone long enough without practice that she had forgotten the self-consciousness that kills the pleasure of dancing. She did not lean toward me. She did not maneuver for closeness. She moved with me the way water moves around a stone, naturally, without fuss, and when I looked at her she looked back, which was unusual, and when I said nothing for a long time she said nothing either, which was rarer still. "You are not from the western reaches," I said, eventually. "No." She did not offer more. "Where then?" She considered this. "Far enough that no one here expects anything of me," she said. "It is very restful." I thought about that. "And from me?" I asked. Do you expect nothing from me as well? She looked at me directly, and there was that thing again, the honesty that I couldn't look at without feeling stripped of something. I expect one dance, she said. My lord. Exactly what I asked for. The musicians played and we turned through the circle and the candles threw our shadows long against the stone, and somewhere at the edges of the room, I was aware of Warden Creswick's old eyes following us, with an expression I would have to address later, and I did not care. I did not care at all, because that door in my chest had gone very still and quiet, and the stillness felt like something I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting. I noticed small things about her in the way that one notices things when the whole of one's attention has been claimed without warning. The careful set of her shoulders, not stiff, but held, the posture of a woman who has learned not to make herself less, whatever circumstances might suggest. The warmth in her hands, the healer's hands, which I did not know yet were a healer's, only that they were competent and unhurried, and moved through the circle pattern without clutching at anything. The fact that she never glanced at the room to see if anyone was watching us, because she had decided not to care about that, and then put the decision down and forgotten it. I had been watched my entire adult life. The thing I wanted most, I realized in that dancing moment, was to be in the presence of someone who was not watching me. When the music stopped, she stepped back and inclined her head with genuine courtesy, not submission, and said, "Thank you, my lord." That was a kindness. "I would very much like to know your name," I said. She paused, and something moved in her face. Not reluctance, I think, but something more complicated than that, something that had a history I couldn't see. Then she smiled, and it was a real one, and she said, "A woman ought to keep at least one mystery, don't you think?" And then Warden Creswick was at my elbow with the border assessment folded in his hands, and the cold voice of duty in his eyes, and when I turned back, she was gone. I spent the rest of the Midwinter Rite looking for her. I spent it calmly, I told myself, without urgency, the way a king looks over a room he already owns. I moved between the columns and the feast tables, and the hearths, and the clusters of pack elders, and I looked. But the south hearth was empty. The older woman she had been speaking with had also vanished. By the time the rite concluded and the candles were dying in their sconces and the hall had thinned to the servants clearing the long tables, I had to accept that she was not there. I went to my study and sat at my desk for a long time without opening anything, and my wolf was very quiet inside me, the way a wolf is quiet when it's listening. In the morning, I asked my steward about the guests from outside the reaches who had attended the rite. He gave me a list. There were 43 names on it. None of them were women from far enough away that no one expected anything of them. None matched what I could describe to him, which was a plain green dress, dark hair, a silver comb, and a laugh that didn't try to carry. "She must have come with someone else's party," my steward said, "under another name, perhaps, or simply unrecorded. It happens at the Midwinter Rite, when the floor is open." "Find her," I said. He bowed and went to find her, and he came back 3 weeks later and told me he couldn't. I told myself this was not a loss. A man who had held the western reaches together through a disputed succession and 2 border crises did not lose something he had held for one dance. I told myself this was a passing sensation, something that would settle into proportion once enough time had gone by. The time went by. It did not settle. A year passed. I attended the Midwinter Rite again and looked for her, and she was not there. I continued the border assessments and the council sessions and the northern patrols and the management of 3,000 souls who depended on the western reaches holding, and I was good at all of it, which was what mattered. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when my wolf was restless, I did not examine too carefully why he was restless. 2 years. 3. I took no mate, which drew comment, which I ignored. My council brought candidates forward at irregular intervals, the daughters of allied packs, gracious women with considerable standing, and nothing behind their eyes that interested me at all. I was polite and final. They went home. In the 5th year, a woman named Aldris Fayan of Millhaven Pack came to Thornvale on a trade delegation and laughed at something her escort said, low and unhurried and meant for no one, and I crossed a room without deciding to and had to stop myself 3 paces away because she turned and it was not her, and I stood there with my heart in my hands and my wolf howling something at me that I finally stopped pretending I couldn't hear. I went back to my study that night and I sat with it properly for the first time. One dance. A single Midwinter Rite. 5 years gone. A woman whose name I did not know, whose pack I did not know, from far enough away that no one expected anything, and my wolf had gone quiet and still the moment he caught her laugh, and had not been properly quiet since. I was the Alpha King of the Western Reaches. I commanded 19 packs and 400 square leagues of territory, and a council of men who had seen 5 reigns. I was also, it appeared, a man who had been waiting 5 years for a woman whose name he'd never learned. I called my head tracker, a grizzled former scout named Baronwick, and I told him what I knew. A plain green dress, 5 years ago, a silver comb, dark eyes, a laugh, not from the Reaches, an older woman companion, arrived without formal record. Baronwick looked at me for a long moment with the particular expression of a man calculating something complicated. Then he said, simply, "I'll need time, my lord." "Take it," I said. He took 7 months. In the 7th month he came back with a name. Her name was Marin. She was from Ashford, a small holding of the Grey Heath Settlement League, 3 days' hard ride east of Thornvale through the Greywood Passes, just far enough that she was outside the Reaches without being enemy territory, living in one of the quiet pockets of wolf country that answer to no Alpha King in particular, only to the moon and to themselves. She had come to the Midwinter Rite 5 years ago with her aunt, who had a trader's pass, and had returned to Ashford the same night, which was why no one had recorded her. She lived alone now. Her aunt had died the previous winter. "What does she do?" I asked. Baronwick said she kept a small healer's practice, medicines, poultices, the knowledge of herbs. Not pack-ranked, not affiliated. Just a woman alone in a small settlement, doing useful work. I sat with this. I looked at the map of the Greywood Passes. I looked at the approximate location of Ashford, marked in Baronwick's careful hand. "Does she know?" I asked. "That we were looking?" "No, my lord," Baronwick said. "We were quiet." I stood up. I told my steward I would be riding east for a week on a private matter. I told my council that Warden Creswick had authority in my absence. I told Baronwick to saddle 2 horses, his and mine, and tell no one else. I was not going as the Alpha King of the Western Reaches. I had thought about that carefully during the 7 months of waiting, and I had reached a conclusion that would have appalled my council had I shared it with them. I was not going to arrive at her door with a title and a claim and an expectation. If she had left that night without giving me her name, she had left deliberately. She had asked for 1 dance and kept the rest of herself private, and I was not going to override that. I was going to arrive at her door as a man on a winter road who needed a healer's service, and I was going to give her the choice. If she chose not to know me again, I would thank her for whatever she could offer, and I would ride home and I would accept it, and I would find a way to be a better Alpha King than I had been with a quiet wolf who never settled. If she chose otherwise, well, I had a great many things I wanted to say to her. I had been assembling them, quietly, for 5 years. We rode east through the first snow of early winter. The Greywood Passes at that season are a gray and white world, the pines weighed down and the road narrowed by drifts, and the silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, and, beside it, my wolf, not howling now, not restless, but focused, the way he is focused on a threshold, when something is about to change. We rode through the passes on the first day, making poor time across ice-slicked stone, and camped in the hollow of a pine stand where Baronwick built a fire with the efficiency of a man who has slept outdoors in every season. On the second day the terrain opened into the Grey Heath country, rolling and open, snow-covered to the horizon, the sky the color of pewter, and I felt something loosen in me that I had been holding since the moment in the great hall when I had crossed to the south hearth without deciding to. 6 years of holding it. 6 years, and now the passes were behind me, and somewhere ahead was Ashford, and a woman who had asked for 1 dance and then done the gracious thing and gone. Ashford was smaller than I had imagined, not that I had let myself imagine it too carefully. 20 or 30 stone buildings ranged around a central well, a market square gone quiet for the winter, smoke from several chimneys. Baronwick asked at the well, and was directed to the eastern edge of the settlement without any particular surprise, as though strangers asking for the healer was a common enough thing. Her house was a low stone building set back from the road behind a winter garden. The garden was bare, staked, orderly even in the snow. Someone who planned ahead, who cared about order, who would have things ready and waiting when the season changed. A light was burning inside. Baronwick stayed with the horses. He did not ask questions, which was one of the qualities that made him invaluable. I walked to her door and knocked. There was a pause, the pause of someone putting something down and crossing a room, and then the door opened, and she was there, and the door in my chest went absolutely still, in a way it had not been still since the last time I had stood this close to her. 5 years had not changed her in any essential way. There were, perhaps, a few lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there at the Midwinter Rite. Her dark hair was unbound and loose. She was wearing a working dress, and she was holding a small clay pot in her hands, which she had been carrying when she answered the door, and her expression as she looked at me was, for one single heartbeat, completely open, completely recognizing. Then her expression closed, not coldly, but with the care of someone protecting something they value, and she said, "You found me." "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. You look cold." The house was warm and smelled of dried herbs and beeswax and wood smoke. She set the clay pot on the work table, a healer's surface, tools laid out with the same orderliness as the winter garden, and turned to face me, and her arms went briefly across her chest in a gesture I recognized as someone steeling themselves for a conversation they have anticipated. "I wondered," she said, "whether you would come. Did you wonder long?" Her mouth moved. "A while," she said. "Less as the years went by. I thought perhaps the Rite had too many faces in it, and one unremarkable one from the wrong side of the Greywood wouldn't be worth the trouble of remembering." "You're not unremarkable," I said. She looked at me steadily. "How long did it take you to find you?" 7 months of searching. Once I decided to look, but I waited 5 years before I decided. Something shifted in her face. "Why?" I thought about how to say this. I had been assembling it for 5 years. Surely I had the words. And yet standing in her house with the herb smell and the lamplight and her dark eyes watching me with that impossible honesty, I could not reach for the assembled version. What came out instead was simple. "Because I wanted to come as a man," I said, "not as a title. I didn't want to arrive and find that you said yes to the wrong thing." She was very still for a moment. Then she turned and went to the hearth and set a kettle to heat, with the efficiency of someone who needs to do something with their hands, and I stood in the middle of her workroom and waited, which I had become very good at. "You'd better sit down," she said. "You rode from Thornvale. That's 3 days in this weather. 2.5 riding hard. Sit down anyway." I sat. She brought 2 cups when the kettle had done its work, and she sat across from me at the work table with hers wrapped in both hands, and she said, "I should tell you something." "All right." "When I came to the Midwinter Rite, I was not," she paused. "I did not intend to speak to you. My aunt wanted to see the Rite, and I came with her. I was going to stay at the edges and be quiet and invisible, which is what I am best at. And then the musicians changed their measure, and I laughed at something my aunt said, and—" She stopped. "And I came across the hall," I said. "Yes." She looked at her cup. "And you asked me to dance. And another pause. I should have said no. I knew I should. A woman from a settlement with no pack name doesn't dance with the Alpha King and walk away from it cleanly. But you asked in such an odd way, as though you didn't quite know why you were asking, and it seemed—" She shook her head. "True," I offered. She looked up. "Yes," she said quietly. "It seemed true. So you asked for one dance." "So I asked for one dance," she said, and afterward I thought, I will go home before this becomes something I can't put down. Before I want more than what I was offered." She looked at me with those steady eyes. "I thought about you," she said, "more than I planned to. But I also thought you would forget. Men with 300 wolves in a hall and a crown on their heads do not spend 5 years thinking about one dance with a woman from the wrong side of the Greywood." "This one did," I said. She was quiet for a long time. The fire moved and the kettle settled, and outside the winter pressed against the stone walls of her small house, and I looked at her hands around the cup, the healer's hands, competent and still, and I waited. "What are you asking?" she said finally. "I want to hear you say it plainly." I looked at her. I thought about the 5 years and the restless wolf and the moment at the Midwinter Rite when Aldris Fan of Millhaven had laughed and I had crossed a room without choosing to, and the cold, precise understanding that had come to me after. My wolf has been still only once in 5 years, I said. The night I danced with you. I don't know if that means what I think it means. I won't claim certainty about a single dance, but I'd like the chance to find out. I paused, and I would like you to know, clearly, that I am not here to ask as the Alpha King. I am here to ask as the man who danced with you and then spent 5 years being an idiot about it. Those are different things. You have the right to say no to both of them. She looked at me for so long that I thought she was going to. Not cruelty. She didn't have that in her. But a considered, careful no. The kind that comes from a woman who has protected herself with good reason and knows the cost of stopping. Then she said, "It's early winter. The Greywood passes are not kind to riders in early winter." "No," I agreed, "they're not." "You would need somewhere to stay," she said, "while the roads are bad. Or that is, if you were the sort of man who might, that is." She stopped, and something remarkable happened. A faint warmth rose in her face, and she pressed her lips together. And for one moment, she looked exactly as she had by the south hearth when she'd pressed her hand over her own mouth to contain her laugh. "I am exactly that sort of man," I said. She nodded, once, and I watched her make the decision and then put it down into herself where it could rest, and the steadiness came back to her face along with something newer, something that wasn't yet happiness but was closely adjacent to it, the way the sky looks before the light actually arrives. "There's a spare room," she said. "The bed is small, you're too tall for it." "I have slept in worse things," I said. "I expect so," she said. "You're the Alpha King." And then the corner of her mouth curved. "Though you're not here as that, of course." "Of course," I said. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the winter road. I watched her profile in the lamplight, the clean line of her jaw, the dark hair she hadn't bothered to pin, the way she held herself, not straight with effort but simply upright, naturally, as though she had never learned to make herself smaller, or had learned and then refused to practice it. "I have been alone a long time," she said, to the window. "My aunt was the last of my family who was close, and she died, and I am accustomed to myself. I think you should know that." "I am accustomed to myself as well," I said. "We will have that in common." "That may make us either very well suited," she said, "or completely impossible. I'm willing to find out." She turned from the window and the lamplight was in her eyes, and she looked at me with that impossible directness, and she said, "You really did spend 5 years." "I really did. On a dance." "On you," I said. "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "That's rather a great deal to do with one dance." "It was a very good dance," I said. And she laughed, low and unhurried and meant for nothing but itself, and it was exactly the same as it had been in the great hall of Thornvale Hold 5 years ago by the south hearth, and my wolf went absolutely still in my chest, the same stillness, the door not closing now but opening, properly opening, in the way that means something is entering, not leaving, and I understood, with the kind of understanding that doesn't need to argue with itself, what the stillness meant and had always meant. I stayed through the winter. Not in her spare room, as it turned out, but she was right that the bed was small. She gave me her work table instead, and I slept rolled in my riding cloak on the floor of the main room, like a man half my rank and age, and I found I didn't mind it at all. I had slept in campaigns and in border outposts and in the open under rain, and the floor of a warm house that smelled of herbs and beeswax was considerably better than any of those. Baronwick, to his eternal credit, asked no questions. He found lodging in the settlement's only inn, exercised the horses, and appeared at her door each morning at a reasonable hour to receive whatever instruction I had for the day, which was mostly, "Nothing yet, wait." She did not change for me. That was what I noticed first. Or rather, it was what I noticed and then kept noticing, because it seemed impossible that it would hold, and yet it held. She did her work each day, the patients who came to her door, the medicines to prepare, the records she kept in a small, neat ledger. She cooked in the evening, simple things, good ones. She read at night by the lamp, history and natural philosophy and the occasional volume of old pack lore that she'd acquired from somewhere, which surprised me. "Where did you come by a copy of the Grey Heath census records?" I asked once, and she said, "I like to know who is around me," with the expression of someone who has spent a great deal of time being careful, and it made me understand something about what her solitary years had cost her. She argued with me about the border trade assessments when I explained the situation, and she was right on 2 of her 3 points, which I told her, and wrong on 1, which I also told her, and she accepted the correction the way she accepted everything, directly, without performance. In the second week I helped her dig out the garden path after a heavy snowfall, which she accepted as useful, and then later commented that I had done it wrong with regard to the drainage slope, and showed me the right way, and I redid the section in question, and she stood in the cold with her arms folded and watched me and said, "You're better than I expected, for a king." "Better at digging?" I said. "Better at being corrected," she said. I laughed. My wolf was very warm. In the third week, she told me about her aunt, and the way the settlement had been before the aunt had died, and the way it was after. She spoke carefully, not with grief that was still raw, but with the particular thoughtfulness of someone who has already done much of the private work of loss, and has arrived at a place where it can be looked at steadily. I told her about the early years of my reign, and the border disputes, and the exhaustion of performing certainty for 300 wolves, who needed me to be unshakable. She listened the way she did everything, directly, without interpolation, and then she said, "You've been very alone." "Yes," I said. "So have I," she said, "though differently." "I think it comes to the same thing," I said. "Eventually." She looked at me. "Yes," she said. "I think it does." She had a patient in the 4th week, a boy from the settlement, 12 years old, who had taken a bad fall on the ice and injured his wrist. She set the wrist with hands that were quick and sure, and spoke to the boy the whole time in a low, steady voice that had nothing performative in it, asking him about the particular ice patch that had betrayed him, as though this were a matter of genuine curiosity, which I realized later it was. She had been navigating that settlement and its hazards for years, and she kept track. When the boy's mother offered payment, a wrapped bundle of dried goods, Marin accepted it without hesitation and thanked her with the same courtesy she gave to everyone, and the mother left with the particular expression of a woman who has been well cared for, and I thought, she has been doing this, quietly, in this small settlement, for years, and no one has thought to honor it. Afterward, when the house was quiet again, she sat for a moment at the work table, with her hands around her cup, and looked at nothing for a bit. And I understood that this was what her life was. Small acts of competence, day after day, in a quiet settlement, where no one would remark on them, or think them anything extraordinary. Because that was what useful, unglamorous work looked like, and she had chosen it deliberately, and she was good at it, and I thought of 3,000 souls under my care, and found I respected her version of it more than I could easily say. Somewhere in the 4th week, she reached across the work table to hand me something, an old map, one I'd asked about the roads east, and her hand brushed mine, and she didn't move it, and neither did I, and the lamplight was very warm, and outside the winter was pressing against the walls with the heavy patience of a season that has all the time in the world. "I thought about you more than I planned to," she said again, quietly, as though reminding herself. "I know," I said. "I didn't want to," she said. "It seemed impractical." "Very impractical," I agreed. "And yet," she said. "And yet," I said. Her hand was warm under mine. My wolf was the quietest I had ever known him, not the quiet of suppression, but the quiet of something completed, a sound that has found its resolution. I told her the truth, then, carefully, piece by piece, the way you move across uncertain ground, not rushing, but not retreating either. I told her what it had been like, the 5 years, the moment at the Midwinter Rite when I had understood that the restlessness was not going to resolve on its own, the decision to find her without title or expectation. The 2.5-day ride through the Greywood passes in early winter, which had been genuinely unpleasant. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You could have had anyone." "No," I said, "I couldn't." She looked at me for a long time with those steady, honest eyes that had been disarming me since the first moment I'd seen them, and I held her gaze and let her look, because I had learned by then that this was what she needed, to see plainly, without it being managed for her. "What would it mean," she said, "for me, if I chose this?" "It would mean coming to Thornvale," I said. "Eventually, when you're ready. It would mean the council and the pack and the particular difficulties of being seen after spending years being unseen. It would also mean," I paused, It would mean me, for whatever that is worth. A man who took 5 years to be sensible about a dance. That's quite an honest accounting, she said. You seem to prefer honesty, I said. I do, she said, very much. She looked down at our joined hands on the work table. Then she looked up. You said you wanted to come as a man, not a title. Yes. Is there a difference? She asked. Genuinely. I want to know how you think about it. I thought about it. The title comes with obligations, I said, with the weight of 3,000 people and 19 packs and the western reaches. I would never pretend it doesn't. But the title is also what I do, not what I am. What I am is the man who crossed that hall without deciding to, because I heard you laugh. Those are different things, even if they travel in the same body. She was quiet. I will not press you, I said. I want to be clear about that. Whatever you decide, I will not. I won't diminish you. I won't override your choice. If you decide this isn't what you want, I will go home, and I will think of you with nothing but gratitude, for 5 weeks I did not expect to have. Her throat moved. She looked at our hands again for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, I asked you for one dance. Yes, I said. And then I went home because I was afraid to want more. I know. That was, she said, in retrospect, quite foolish of me. The warmth that went through me then was not my wolf's. It was simply mine. The whole of me, the man not the title, the person who had spent 5 years learning to be patient about something he cared about, more than he had known how to say. Marin, I said, which was the first time I had said her name aloud, because Baronwick had given it to me, but I had been saving it. I should very much like to take you dancing again. Someday, when you're ready. She looked at me, and her eyes were bright, and the corner of her mouth moved, and she said, I think I might like that. Good, I said. One dance won't be enough this time, she said. I should warn you. No, I agreed. It won't. We didn't speak for a while after that. The fire moved and the winter pressed against the walls, and her hand was in mine on the work table, and my wolf was the great quiet that is not emptiness but fullness, the stillness after a long road that arrives at the right house. She came to Thornvale with the spring thaw, when the greywood passes opened again. She came with one trunk and her small ledger and her case of healer's tools, and she came without ceremony. We had agreed on that, quietly, during the last weeks in Ashford, not because the moment was small, but because she was not a woman who belonged to ceremony. She belonged to what was real, and what was real was the two of us arriving at the hold together on a clear March morning and walking through the main gate and letting the world make what it would of that. The council met us in the great hall. I had told them almost nothing, which was its own kind of statement. What I had told them was, I had found my mate, she was from Ashford, she was not pack-ranked, and she had my full backing. That was enough. And also, it was going to have to be. Old Warden Creswick was the one who broke the silence in the hall. He had seen 5 reigns and assessed each of them with the calm of a man who plans to outlast them all, and he looked at her, at Marin, standing beside me in her traveling dress with her dark hair pinned with the same silver comb I had seen 5 years ago by the south hearth, and something changed in his ancient face, something that softened unexpectedly, and he inclined his head with deliberate and unmistakable respect and said, My lord, my lady. The hall followed him, the way a hall will always follow a man who has seen 5 reigns. Later, in the council chamber, Creswick told me privately that he had noticed her that Midwinter Rite, 6 years before, had noticed me crossing the hall toward her, had seen the dance, and had understood something that I had not understood myself until much later. He said this without triumph, only with the quiet observation of a man who has watched 5 kings and learned that the shape of a thing is often visible from outside before it is visible from within. I thanked him. He nodded once, in the way of a man who considers the matter settled, and we went back to the border assessments. She stood beside me and received the council's welcome with exactly the composure I had known she would have. Not triumph, not relief, just steady and present and absolutely herself. And I thought about the woman who had said she was accustomed to being unseen, and I thought about what it must cost her to stand in that hall and be seen at last. Not the cost of fear, but the cost of allowing it, of standing still while the world looked, which is a different and harder thing than hiding. I thought about the door in my chest going still on the night I heard her laugh, and I was so grateful. For a laugh that hadn't tried to carry, For a woman who'd asked for only what she wanted and gone home when she had it. For 5 years and a ride through the Greywood passes in early winter, and a spare room with a small bed and a healer who corrected my drainage work without a moment's apology. For one dance that had been, in the end, a great deal more. She established a healer's room in the east wing of Thornvale within the first month, requested it herself, told the steward what she needed, arranged it without fuss. The pack came to her with their troubles the way they had come to healers since there were packs, and she received them without ceremony and kept her small ledger, and in the evenings she told me about them in terms that told me nothing of their private matters but gave me, quietly, a picture of the hold I had not had access to from the council table. The family in the northern quarter is having a harder winter than they've said, she told me once, matter-of-factly. The second child is underfed. I've sent them from the stores. I hope that's all right. I told her it was more than all right. She nodded and went back to her book, as though this were obvious, which it was. In the evenings now, when the council sessions are done and the hold has gone quiet, she comes to my study and she reads by the lamp. I work. Sometimes we talk, often we don't. My wolf is very still, the permanent quiet of something settled, something that has found its proper ground and will not be moved from it. Sometimes I watch her read and I think about all the versions of that Midwinter Rite I might have attended, all the ways I might have been elsewhere in that hall, or looking in a different direction, or simply been the kind of man who doesn't cross a room for an unperformed laugh. Then I stop thinking about it, because she's here, and thinking about the ways she might not be seems like very poor use of the time. Once, late in the spring, she looked up from her reading and caught me watching her, and she said, with the particular dry warmth that I had come to know was how she expressed affection when affection embarrassed her. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" I said. "Looking," she said. "Like you're memorizing something." "I am," I said. She looked at me. Then she put her book down and came across the study and stood in front of me, and she said, in the voice she uses when she wants to say something true and wants to be sure it lands, "You don't have to memorize me. I'm not going anywhere." I took her hand, the healer's hand, the hand that had been warm in mine at Thornvale and then warm again in her house in Ashford, with the winter against the walls. "I know," I said, "but I find I like it anyway." She looked at me for a moment with those eyes that have always been too honest to evade. Then she leaned down and pressed her forehead briefly, lightly, against mine. The old sign, the pack sign, the greeting that means, "I am here, I know you, I choose to stay." And then she straightened and went back to her chair and picked up her book. My wolf was quiet, the room was warm. Outside the spring evening was doing something soft and blue with the light over the hold, and somewhere in the courtyard the pack wolves had settled for the night, and the hold was at peace with itself in a way I had not known it to be in 6 years of ruling. She had asked me for one dance, once, in the middle of a Midwinter Rite, and then gone home before I could learn her name. I had found her. We had found each other. That was all it was, and all it needed to be. I went back to my papers, and my wolf rested, and the lamp burned between us in the quiet of a hold that has finally, after long enough, learned the shape of something it was always supposed to hold.